And today's introduction is going to be presented by Professor Robert Destro, who is a professor of law at Catholic University. Robert?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bob Destro, and it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Hochberg. He's a regular contributor and does a great job and certainly in my impression. But let me give you some background. He's the president of Peripluis LLC and provides advisory services on strategy, technology, and organizational design. He's a visiting scholar at the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge, where he's now working on a book devoted to applied geopolitics. While he was when he was employed in the private sector, he's done a number of different high-tech companies, one of which was acquired by Nokia, and he can talk about all of that. He was the Chinese national champions, presented an existential threat to his businesses. And he took away from that the lesson that the United States during those years didn't really attempt to confront those national champions. And he wrote what he called the Long Telegram for the 21st Century, a document that denounced the Chinese regime's illegitimate practices. That document was shared with the U.S. government. I was one of the people who shared it around the State Department, and is now to be found on his Substack called Long Walls. I recommend that you read it over. I think it's worth a read. And so some of his most recent work, which I find absolutely fascinating, is the current dilemma that the United States and its allies find themselves in, fighting a multi-front war. His recent work on Atrocity as a strategy of warfare in Gaza was later confirmed by the comments of Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, as published in the Wall Street Journal. He's published in a number of different places: National Review, The Hill, Rear Clear Defense, East Company, and the Naval War College Review. Michael, take it away.
Thanks, Bob. So the goal of the talk today is to do three things. The first is I'm going to talk a little bit about propaganda and influence operations, both history and present and the near future. Then I'm going to talk a bit about Hamas, and then I'm going to leave you with some predictions for what the next few years are going to look like. If you have a question that you regard as urgent, feel free to interrupt me, but otherwise I'll leave as much time as I can for questions at the end. So it's I have to say it's a pleasure to see a group of people with such a diverse set of backgrounds here for this talk, because I think one of the wonderful things about the Mackinder Forum over the last few years is that it's an opportunity for people from backgrounds in industry and academia and government and the think tank world and the military world and the engineering world to all get together and talk about topics where the solutions necessarily partake of all of those different fields. So there have been a number of different eras of propaganda and influence operations. And the ground for these propaganda and influence operations is necessarily defined by technology. And the strategies of atrocity that I wrote about in those papers really emerge from the fact that social media has become such an important tool for how people see the world. So if you look back at sort of the prehistory of propaganda and influence operations, a lot of it was about the written word, printing presses, pamphlets, books. I read Schweitzer's book not that long ago, Victory, where I was impressed to see that a lot of Western influence operations into the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc were organized around shipping copy machines, shipping Xerox machines, shipping mimeograph machines, books and pamphlets in and out of the Eastern Bloc. It struck me as incredibly inconvenient, but nevertheless very powerful. If you look at the latter half of the 20th century, the information environment was largely dominated by radio and TV. Certainly newspapers and the printed word mattered, but the most efficient ways of getting information into the hands of the populace, into the minds of the populace, was through radio and TV. And these had a specific set of characteristics. The first is that they were one-to-many, right? They were broadcast media. And that meant that there was very limited capacity for customization and targeting. The messaging had to be carefully designed to appeal to very broad audiences. And there was limited, if any, direct feedback. There was limited opportunity, if any opportunity, for any kind of individual targeting. With Twitter getting started in 2006, Instagram in 2010, TikTok in 2016, and that sequence is from text to pictures to video, by the way, as bandwidth got cheaper and broadband became more widely accessible. With all of that, we have these social media tools, and social media tools, I think of them as being quasi-interactive, personalized broadcast media. And what I mean by that is that the content is not customized on a per user basis. All of the content is generated not for a particular user, but it's generated as a sea of content, and then the platform chooses which bits of those content go to each individual user. And so while it seems to be highly customized, because in fact there is a great deal of content for all tastes and all purposes, it's not actually customized. The mix of content is customized, but the content itself is not. One of the things that people certainly within the industry have noticed is that these, and we can talk about this more after the talk if people want to discuss it, I imagine they might, is that these social media engines are in effect engines for radicalization, because they're advertising driven, and that means that what they do is they monetize attention, and more attention means more revenue. The way you get more attention is by generating addiction, and the way you generate addiction is through extreme reaction. And so putting content in front of people that tends to radicalize them and generate extreme emotional reactions, and the term of art for this is doom scrolling, where you just see a series of things that you can't stop looking at. For me personally, that's pictures of dogs doing silly things, but everyone has different things that they're interested in. Whatever produces extreme reactions generates more attention and more revenue. And so what that means is that the platform operators have very little incentive. In fact, they have negative incentive to turn down radicalization, because turning down radicalization turns down revenue. And so that's a big problem with these platforms. Now, the platforms have tools for doing what I think of as exquisite targeting. So each person's history, what they've paid attention to, what they've watched, on what device, in what context, is tracked to the millisecond. So there's a lot of powerful tools that these platforms have to push content that is maximally addictive. They use personal information, your history, your geography, what they know about what you've purchased, economic variables, demographics. All of that is used, and all of that is targetable, in the sense that if I'm someone who wants to push content out and push advertising out, I can optimize it and even explicitly target it at specific individuals on the basis of that data. And Marcus told me a wonderful story which we could cover in the question and answer period about how you can actually de-anonymize people based on knowing 3 or 4 things about them in order to target specific ads at specific individuals. And he told me that a couple of years ago because he'd done it to one of his friends, and it's really impressive how powerful this is. So because the content is still produced generically, it's not generated in real time. What the platforms have control over is the mix of content, but these platforms are fundamentally not interactive. Now, people talk about the targeting for this as being AI, and certainly AI and ML are used for it, but it's not necessary. You can do this on the basis of statistics and other tools. The hyperscalers who run these platforms generally like to claim a lack of agency in the sense that they don't have the ability to economically or simply eliminate foreign actor or politically extreme content. But I regard that position fundamentally as being a lie. And the reason I believe that that's a lie is because in the situations where they have strict liability and where strict liability and where they actually have danger of extreme brand harm, and where the two line up, and the place where that lines up is child pornography, they make a really serious effort at keeping it off the platform, and they are mostly successful because it serves their economic interests to be mostly successful. The platforms have a lot of power to identify what the sources are of content and what the type is of the content and what what's in the content and who it's targeted at. And so they have a lot of ability to restrict what's on the platforms if they choose to. It's really a question of what they choose to do this for, because it is expensive. It's not free. What's happening now is a sea change, and that sea change is AI generation of content. So what we're starting to see is that the cost of generating compelling content is dropping to zero in the form of text, voice, image, and video content. We're starting to see that kind of content can be generated at scale, but not yet in real time, except for text, and maybe we're starting to see it for voice. So what we're starting to see is just the tip of the iceberg, where interactive AI content is actually being used for persuasion. There was a story not that long ago out of Hong Kong where there was a fellow who got on a Zoom meeting with a bunch of his colleagues, and he worked in the CFO's office at a company out there, and they went through the process of wiring about $25 million out of the organization into a series of accounts because he was on with his CFO and a bunch of other people who he worked with. And then it was discovered that all of the people he was on the call with were in fact video deepfakes. And the money had all been stolen. And these were people who he knew personally. And so what happened was a group of fraudsters has gotten together and they had pre-scripted a bunch of things for various people to say. And then they had generated video and audio deepfakes of his colleagues that were convincing enough that they convinced him over Zoom. Now, fraudsters have a tendency to target the weak. They look for people who aren't that bright. And they go out of their way to select out anyone who has good judgment. That's why the spam that you get for the Nigerian print scams always has lots of misspellings in it, because they want to filter out anyone who notices the misspellings and thinks maybe this is not legitimate. But the reality is that these tools are getting good enough that you can generate in quasi real time content that is good enough to deceive a human about people they know. And that's no small thing. Now, the technology is not quite good enough yet for that to be deployed at scale, but it will be in the next couple of years. And so what we're going to be seeing next is AI-based persuasion at scale and real-time content and agent generation. So we're already seeing interactive text chatbots where teenagers and some adults are getting addicted to virtual boyfriend and girlfriend chatbots. These kinds of chatbots make an incredibly effective data collection strategy. And with AI and ML, that data collection can be automated. And it's going to become possible to do this for audio and video interaction as well. So what we're going to start to see is agents that are highly persuasive, fully customized, and individually targeted based on information that they have, that adversaries have about the individuals that they're going after. So this is starting to happen with text interaction. And this is going to be a sea change in the information security and disinformation and information warfare environment. So this is, by the way, why I wrote a piece a couple of years ago with General Spalding about the importance of digital border controls to stop these kinds of tools being used in the US at scale by our adversaries. So that's a little bit about the future. But coming back to Hamas and strategies of atrocity, Hamas and their Iranian sponsors have pursued a novel strategy that takes advantage of the current technological and political environment. And that current environment is largely defined by their ability to reach out through social media and by their allies to reach out through social media in order to shape the information environment among their adversaries here in the US and in the West. We all know, and I'm not going to go through the history of this, but we all know that propaganda and information operations, influence operations can be extremely effective in winning wars because they directly influence the will of both your own and the enemy polity to fight. One of the things that I came across not that long ago in reading about this was I was reading about Gandhi because he was quite brilliant about weaponizing nonviolence as a strategy for influencing both domestic opinion in India and British public opinion. And I'm going to quote him for a second because he's associated with nonviolence as a moral position. But from reading a little bit about him, it seems to me that it was more of a practical tactic than a moral position. So he said, and I quote, "I do believe that where there is only a choice between cowardice and violence, I would advise violence. I would rather have India resort to arms in order to defend her honor than that she should in a cowardly manner become or remain a helpless witness to her own dishonor." The quote goes on. I can show you the link if anyone is interested in this. What I thought was striking was that Gandhi's nonviolence and Hamas's use of atrocity are both strategies that were deployed to shape the information environment and behavior of their own polity and of their adversaries. So there's a certain symmetry. So Hamas's use of human shields and hostages by embedding their fighters among the population is a way of weaponizing harm to non-combatants for information warfare. It's a way for them for their supporters and their sympathizers to seize their perceived moral high ground. So in Hamas, what we've seen is a new and innovative type of war. Hamas is perhaps the first regime in recorded history, at least the first one that I'm aware of, to fight a war that was actually consciously designed to maximize casualties among their own population. To me, that's an amazing thought. It sort of goes against the entire Western way of war in some sense. So, the October 7th attack was premeditated, it was carefully planned, and it was out of some of the same textbooks that have informed the tactics of ISIL. And Ophir Selikar, who's a Mackinder Forum regular, was kind enough to provide some of the references for this. One of them is a book called The Jurisprudence of Jihad, or the Jurisprudence of Blood, which provides theological justification for inflicting extreme violence on enemies, as well as a list of tactics that are used, such as beheading, torture, burning prisoners alive, etc. The second book was a book called Management of Savagery, which urged jihadists to commit attention-grabbing atrocities in order to attract recruits and sow fear in the enemy. And then there's an IRGC doctrine that she identified for using human shields, for the use of human shields, which is out of a brigadier general in the IRGC called the Quranic Principle of War. As I was thinking back on this, preparing for this talk, it occurred to me to wonder, and this is something we could discuss, if the ISIL and Hamas atrocities and the attacks on the World Trade Center were all similar in that they were all designed to generate Western entanglement and response. It strikes me that that might actually be the case. So the atrocities of October 7th created a clear and unsolvable dilemma for the Israeli government. They really had two options. The first was to fail to respond in a military way, and in that case, the government would collapse, and any hope of ongoing Israeli deterrence would be utterly diluted, both toward Hamas and toward the other Iranian proxies that they're fighting with. The other option that they had was to respond forcefully, and regardless of the details of their response and their compliance with the laws of war and their restraint, regardless of the details of what they actually did, they would inevitably be accused of genocide, war crimes, disproportionate attacks on civilians, and so forth. And and they would find themselves attacked in social media and in the press with campaigns on the basis of those accusations. And so the neither of these was a particularly appealing outcome, which goes to the brilliance of the strategy by Hamas. It created a ugly, unsolvable dilemma for the Israeli government. So this stemmed from some analytical and intelligence failures on the part of the Israelis, and there's a couple of wonderful articles about this from that Michaela Dodge was kind enough to show me from NIPP, which I can show you the references if you're interested. But really, my sense of the failures was threefold. The first is that the Israelis assumed that Hamas was busy with governance and with the responsibilities as a government, and that Israeli economic engagement with Gaza would produce moderation over time. The second was an over-reliance on technological solutions, especially the Iron Dome and the instrumented border fence. And the third was that the Israeli assumption that the combination of carrots and sticks, the carrots being allowing several $100 million a year of Qatari funding to flow through to Hamas, and the stick of massive military reprisal would be enough to create and maintain deterrence. And the innovation in Hamas's strategy was to actually take advantage of what the Israelis and the West regarded as a stick, which is the harm that would accrue to both Hamas and to the whatever part of the population is comprised of non-combatants, which we regarded as a stick, as a artifact of Western strategic culture. Hamas does not regard as a stick. They regard that response as a positive because it allows them to shape the information environment. This was so there was a fundamental misunderstanding of Hamas's strategic culture, and this is part of what we wrote about in these articles. The first is that Iran was using Hamas as a proxy to break the emergent détente between Arab states and Israel, and that was a desired outcome. Hamas used the atrocities of January 6th and the Israeli response to go from essentially irrelevance on the world stage into a central role in the political discourse around the world. And Hamas achieved several things. The first is that they managed to discredit Israel with a large fraction of their supporters around the world and to extract a massive price from Western politicians who have chosen to continue supporting Israel. They've managed to play a meaningful role in ongoing US and European electoral politics. They've managed to mobilize violent crowds and generate riots and attacks on Jews in Western cities. They've managed to accuse Israel of genocide and use these accusations in social media in order to seize the initiative in terms of influence operations. And they've managed to leverage the combination of hostages, underground infrastructure, and the suffering of the Gazan population in order to survive and extend the war far beyond anything anyone expected, especially given the balance of forces from a purely military perspective. When we wrote the paper on the strategy of atrocity in March, we identified three possible outcomes. The first was a Hamas victory, which would result in the death or flight of essentially everyone in Israel. The second was Israel fighting to an unconditional surrender, not just of Hamas, but of the Gazan population. And it bears description what that would mean. So an unconditional surrender would mean that anyone who participated in the events of October 7th, anyone who passed on orders, and anyone who provided material support would be either dead or captured and put on trial. That same goes for anyone involved in the capture, detention, or abuse of the hostages. Anyone who was committed to the Hamas regime as an administrator, politician, tax collector, etc., would be detained, debriefed, and held to account for war crimes in which they were involved. At the end of a war like this, the military and political leaders responsible for these attacks would have been either killed in battle, tried for their complicity in war crimes, or would be in flight, like the leadership of the Nazi Party after World War II. Furthermore, the international organizations complicit with Hamas would no longer have any role in the governance or support of Gaza, most especially UNRWA, but certainly not limited to them. There's a third option that we identified, which is a forever war. A forever war is one in which neither side can achieve a comprehensive victory. Neither side is prepared to surrender or compromise. And in such a scenario, Hamas would continue to deploy asymmetric military means such as terror attacks and launching missiles at civilian targets to secure several goals. First, to remind the population that Hamas is taking the lead in destroying Israel. Second, to survive as a military force. Third, to reignite the conflict with Israel when, in the future, a strategic opening presents itself. And fourth, to generate ongoing strife and thus suffering for the Gazans, responsibility for which can be shifted onto Israel in the international media environment. From Hamas and Iran's perspective, and this is an interesting thing, at least I think it's an interesting thing. From a Western perspective, we look at what's gone on in Gaza and we see Hamas as being on the verge of being defeated. Many of their fighters have been killed, much of their infrastructure has been destroyed. Most of the Gaza metro has been either blown up or damaged. They're not successfully launching very many rockets into Israel. Their population is many of them are displaced. This looks from the outside and from a Western perspective like defeat. From a Hamas perspective, this looks like victory. They have achieved many of their strategic goals. Hamas's leadership is still intact overseas in Qatar and other places. Sinwar and the local leadership cadre have not been captured or killed. They're still in possession of an unknown number of Western hostages, including Americans. And if you actually listen to what Sinwar had to say in June, not that long ago, yes, thank you, Moran, 120 in total. Although how many of them are still alive is, at this point, sadly, anyone's guess. What Sinwar said was, and I quote, we have the Israelis right where we want them. We have the Israelis right where we want them. And these are not the words of a defeated enemy. This is an enemy leader who believes that he is in the process of achieving victory. So Western observers broadly misunderstand the ongoing dynamics because they view Hamas's strategy through a Western lens. Hamas has been consistent in their statements in saying that they regard non-combatant casualties and civilian suffering as an unambiguous good, as blame can be transferred to the Israelis. Distinctions between civilians and combatants are explicitly an artifact of Western strategic culture. Many of the adversaries of the West today don't partake of this strategic culture. They have their own utterly distinct ways of war. To the extent that they comply with Western ideas about limited warfare, human rights, civilian military distinctions, it's because they fear the consequences of prompting a response from the United States. But even American hegemony over the post-Cold War period was insufficient to stop what occurred in Srebrenica, Xinjiang, Darfur, Grozny, and any number of other massacres that were too numerous to mention. The United States has acted to restrain Israel throughout this war. That kind of restraint is a perfect recipe for producing forever wars and frozen conflicts as an outcome, rather than an unconditional surrender of the enemy. And this is part of a broader pattern. This is something that we pointed out in the piece that we wrote about Our Restraint Destroys Your Deterrent, which was a letter to allies. This is part of a broader pattern which is playing out in Ukraine and which has played out throughout the post-World War II era, where the United States has not allowed our proxies and allies to win unconditional victories. We have restrained our allies consistently, and through a combination of tepid backing and explicit restraint, and explicitly forcing our allies to pull back from victory. This is an artifact of United States politics. The modern polity in the United States does not have the stomach for wars that involve mass civilian casualties in order to achieve victory by our allies. Now, we seem to have the stomach for it for ourselves, if you look at Fallujah as an example, but we do not have the stomach to allow our allies to do it. If and when we feel an existential threat, this will surely change, but the United States, our political class certainly does not feel an existential threat at the moment. And one of the things that has emerged is that the threat of nuclear escalation, and this shows up in Ukraine and in Taiwan, is used domestically as an argument for caution and restraint rather than for the defense of our allies. The consequence of this kind of restraint is, if you play it out, ceding spheres of influence to our autocratic adversaries. If we're not prepared to sponsor our allies to win, what good are we as an ally? And so we've written a bit about this in a piece about distributed deterrence and the importance of trusting our allies more and ourselves less when it comes to the defense of our allies. So one thing that our adversaries surely see is that Hamas has been remarkably successful against dramatically superior conventional military force. And so the pattern of an attack involving gross atrocity, a politically necessary counterattack by a Western power, and then an appeal to progressive elements within the polity of the attacked state and within the polity of their supporters in the West, is and that appeal being on the basis of comparative military weakness and poverty with regard to the state or non-state entity doing the attacking and committing the atrocities. That's a formula that we're going to see others try to replicate and innovate. And that's a very worrying thing, because having not sponsored the Israelis to respond in a way that would teach the lesson that strategies of atrocity produce immediate and overwhelming defeat. We have unfortunately taught the lesson that these are strategies that work, and in human affairs, when people see strategies that work, they tend to replicate them and innovate on them. So I'll leave you with 5 or 6 predictions for the near future. The first is that AI and machine learning is going to be weaponized for customized mass persuasion at scale. This is going to play out in pretty radical changes over the next few years. I think by the time 10 years out rolls around, this kind of tool is going to be regarded as a standard feature of the international political environment. We're going to start to see this sort of thing becoming important within the next 2 or 3 years. One of the things that people don't quite appreciate outside the AI world is that the things that exist in the lab today tend to make it to mass scale within 2 or 3 years, because the only gap between deploying something in the lab and deploying it at scale is availability of hardware, and perhaps a reason to do it. And the hardware is getting deployed at a shocking pace. Witness the rise in value of NVIDIA, if nothing else. I do not expect that there will be any sovereign Palestinian state in Gaza for the foreseeable future. But Hamas will not see this as a defeat. I think the most likely outcome, based on what we're seeing so far, is some form or the other of Israeli-sponsored Quisling regime. Israel will not allow Hamas to survive as an intact military force in Gaza, but there will be an ongoing insurgency of one sort or the other. The successful tactics and technologies will spread. One of those is from October 7th, the surprise use of drones to take out critical command and control nodes in the early hours of the attack was decisive. Air warfare is currently mostly offensive dominant because the counter munitions are much harder and more expensive to build than the offensive munitions. What that means is that Hamas and Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies will continue to use drones and missiles against Israel for both tactical and strategic effect, as well as economic harm, which is a form of strategic effect, until the technology emerges to use directed energy to shift the technology environment to one that is defensive dominant for air war. This is starting to happen right now. The directed energy tools are getting deployed. And that means that the enormous investment that Hezbollah and Iran have made in rockets, there's estimated to be hundreds of thousands of short and mid-range munitions in the north of Israel, they may start to see this as a use it or lose it short-term scenario. And so that may provide strong impetus for them to use those munitions rather than sitting on them. We're also going to see tunnel warfare becoming a much more broadly used tool because it's been so effective for Hamas. It is unclear whether Israel will fight to an unconditional surrender or not. There are some in Israel who are advocating for things that are in that end of the spectrum, but it's not clear that the Israelis have the stomach for it, and it's not clear that the United States will allow them to do so. In fact, it seems very unlikely that the United States will not allow it, even if the Israelis wanted it. I expect that strategies of atrocity will be deployed and modified and innovated elsewhere over the next few years to create the same dilemmas for Western-oriented regimes that they created for the Israelis, particularly by Islamic-oriented organizations, but not necessarily limited to them. And the more dependent a target state is on the US, the more likely it is that strategies of atrocity are going to be deployed. I will leave you with one dispiriting thought, which is, although it is not strictly speaking what I would call a strategy of atrocity, certainly taking hostages generally falls into this spectrum of activities. And China, and this is out of Bloomberg, China has already taken perhaps 5,000 foreign business people and denied them exit permits, which means that they are indefinitely detained in China. It's hard for me to call that anything other than taking hostages at scale. Those hostages are not being tortured, but they are certainly being detained. So I will leave you with that. I'd like to thank Michaela Dodd for the reports that she pointed me out on deterrence and intelligence failures. I'd like to thank Len for all of his help in developing and supporting these ideas and acting as a co-author on these papers. I'd like to thank Bob for his kind introduction and all of his help over the years. And I'd like to thank Ophir Selikar, who was incredibly helpful in understanding the intellectual basis of ISIS and Hamas's strategy. Thank you all very much.